The crystal decanter slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the Beaumont mansion. Whiskey pooled like liquid amber between the shards, filling the air with its sharp bite. My breath caught in my throat as heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway toward the study where I stood frozen, a 17-year-old girl surrounded by evidence of my clumsiness. Mabel Ruth. Everett's voice boomed through the mahogany doors, each syllable dripping with the controlled fury I'd learned to fear more than his open rage. What in God's name was that? I pressed my back against the towering bookshelf, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The sleeve of my pale blue dress had ridden up, revealing the dark bruises that painted my forearm in shades of purple and yellow. Evidence of last night's lesson in wifely obedience when I dared to ask about writing to my family. "I'm sorry, sir," I whispered, though I knew he couldn't hear me through the thick door. "I'm so sorry." The handle turned with a metallic click that seemed to reverberate through my bones. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change, when the careful plan I'd been nurturing for months would either bloom into freedom or wither under his wrath. Because tonight, while Everett Beaumont slept off his whiskey in the master bedroom, I would run. The door swung open. Let me tell you how a girl becomes a ghost. How she learns to disappear while standing in plain sight to silence her voice until even she forgets the sound of her own laughter. My name is Mabel Ruth Calloway, and I am 76 years old, now sitting on a front porch in Tennessee where the mockingbirds sing at dawn and the air carries the scent of honeysuckle instead of fear. But that day in the Beaumont mansion, I was 17 and desperate, a full 3 years into a marriage that had stolen my childhood and nearly claimed my soul. 3 years since that August morning when my father sold me to a man old enough to be my grandfather for $20 and the promise of debt forgiveness at the company store. I was born in 1948 in northern Alabama, in a place so small it existed more as a suggestion than a town. We lived in a shotgun house with rooms strung together like beads on a thread, 8 children and 2 parents, who loved us in the hard way of people who'd never known softness. Daddy worked shares on someone else's land, growing cotton, under the Alabama sun that baked the earth to clay and left us all dry as tumbleweeds by September. School was a luxury we couldn't afford most days. The nearest schoolhouse stood 3 miles away, and during planting and harvest, every pair of hands was needed in the fields. But in winter, when the ground froze hard as concrete and there was nothing to do but wait for spring, I'd walk that dirt road to learn my letters and numbers from Mrs. Wilson, who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. "You've got a quick mind, Mabel Ruth," she'd say, pressing a worn book into my hands. "Don't let it go to waste." I'd read those books by kerosene lamp after the others had gone to sleep, devouring stories of places where girls could become teachers or nurses, where they could choose their own paths instead of having their futures bartered away like livestock. I dreamed of Nashville, where the music played all night and the lights never went out, where a girl might disappear into the crowd and remake herself into anyone she wanted to be. Those dreams sustained me through the morning in July 1962, when Daddy called me into the front room, his voice carrying that tone that made all 8 of us children stop whatever we were doing and listen. "Mabel Ruth, come in here. Need to talk to you." I was 14 then, still sleeping on a pallet with my younger sisters, still wearing hand-me-downs with patches on the patches. I had no idea that childhood was about to end with all the suddenness of a door slamming shut. Daddy sat in his chair, the only cushioned seat in the house, rolling an unlit cigarette between his work-roughened fingers. He was a small man, made large by the force of his will, weathered by decades of Alabama sun, and the kind of poverty that carves lines into a man's face like water cutting through stone. "Sit down, girl," he said, nodding to the wooden stool near his feet. I perched there, hands folded in my lap, though something cold and heavy had settled in my stomach. "You're 14 now," he began, striking a match against his boot sole. "Time for you to be a woman. I nodded, thinking maybe this was about the monthly changes that had started the year before, though Mama had already explained those to me in her brief clinical way. "We've arranged a marriage for you." The world stopped. The cicadas outside fell silent. The air in my lungs turned to stone. "Your marriage." The word came out as a whisper. "Yes, your husband has already settled everything with me. You'll go to his house tomorrow." I looked to the doorway where Mama stood, her face drawn, tight eyes fixed on the floorboards. In that moment, I knew there would be no rescue from her corner. "I don't want to get married, Daddy." The words tumbled out before I could stop them. His hand came down hard on the arm of his chair, making me jump. "There isn't any want about it, Mabel Ruth. You think a woman gets to choose, women don't choose. They obey." I was trembling now, my whole body shaking like a leaf in a storm. "Who is he?" Daddy took a long drag on his cigarette, exhaled the smoke in a gray cloud. "Your husband-to-be is Mr. Everett Beaumont." The name hit me like a physical blow. Everett Beaumont owned half the county, including the cotton gin where Daddy took our crop, and the store where we bought what little we couldn't grow or make ourselves. He was 49 years old, a widower with 3 grown sons, the youngest older than me. He lived in the big white house on the hill, the one with columns that could be seen from miles away, a monument to the kind of wealth that most folks in our county would never even dream of touching. "Daddy, please!" I stood up suddenly, my breathing fast and shallow. "He's old enough to be my grandfather. I can't marry him." The slap came so quickly, I didn't see it coming. It knocked me back onto the stool, the sting burning across my cheek, the taste of copper filling my mouth where my teeth had cut the inside of my lip. "You'll marry him and be respectable." Daddy said, his voice flat and final. "Mr. Beaumont has paid a good dowry for you. $20 and forgiveness of our debts. Don't make trouble." $20. The price of a daughter's life. That night, I couldn't sleep. My little sister Jessie, who shared the pallet with me, noticed my tears and curled against me like a kitten seeking warmth. "Why are you crying, Mabel?" she whispered in the darkness. I couldn't answer. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that tomorrow you'll be given to a stranger, that you'll never again sleep in this house, never again have the chance to dream of a different life? So I just held her close, memorizing the smell of her hair, the warmth of her small body against mine, knowing it would be the last time. Morning came with the merciless certainty of sunrise, bringing with it the black automobile that would carry me away from everything I'd ever known. I dressed in my Sunday clothes, a faded blue cotton dress that had been let out at the seams as I grew. It was the only nice thing I owned, and even it was patched at the elbows. Mama brushed my hair with shaking hands, braiding it down my back, with the careful precision of someone trying to memorize the task. "Be strong, my baby," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "It'll be all right." But we both knew she was lying. Mr. Beaumont stepped out of the car when he saw me coming, a tall figure in a pressed suit, his salt and pepper hair slicked back under a wide-brimmed hat. He looked me up and down like a man appraising livestock, his pale blue eyes calculating and cold. "Beautiful girl," he said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You'll give me fine sons." I wanted to vomit. I wanted to run. I wanted to climb my oak tree and never come down. But Daddy's hand was on my shoulder, pushing me forward toward the open car door. "Get in, Mabel Ruth," Daddy said. "Don't keep Mr. Beaumont waiting." I slid into the back seat, the leather soft and foreign beneath my legs. The car smelled of pipe tobacco and something else, something that made my stomach turn. As we pulled away from the house, I pressed my face to the window, watching my family grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. The Beaumont estate sprawled across 20 acres of prime Alabama land, with the main house sitting like a white jewel at its center. The mansion was larger than our church, with towering columns and a wraparound porch that seemed to stretch on forever. Gardens manicured to perfection surrounded the house, each flower bed precisely arranged, each hedge trimmed to mathematical precision. It was beautiful. It was also a prison. A stern-faced woman in a gray dress waited at the front steps, her hands clasped before her like a soldier at attention. This was Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, though I wouldn't learn her name until later. She looked at me with the same calculating assessment I'd seen in Mr. Beaumont's eyes. "Welcome, Miss Calloway," she said, her voice crisp as autumn leaves. "I trust your journey was pleasant." Pleasant. As if I'd come willingly, as if this were some social visit instead of my delivery to a man who'd purchased me like a piece of property. "This way, please," she continued, not waiting for an answer. "You'll need to freshen up before the ceremony." The ceremony. The word made my throat close up tight. In a few hours, I would be Mrs. Everett Beaumont, bound by law and custom to a man who was old enough to be my grandfather. The interior of the house was cool and dark, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and roses. My bare feet sank into carpet thicker than any bed I'd ever slept on. Paintings of stern-faced ancestors stared down from walls paneled in dark wood, their eyes seeming to follow my movement through the hallway. Mrs. Hendricks led me to a bedroom larger than our entire house. A white dress lay spread across a 4-poster bed alongside undergarments finer than anything I'd ever touched. The dress was beautiful, made of silk and lace, with tiny pearl buttons that caught the light from the tall windows. "Mr. Beaumont wants you presentable," Mrs. Hendricks said, eyeing my faded dress with obvious disapproval. "The bathroom is through there. Wash thoroughly. I'll return in 30 minutes to help with your hair." When she left, I stood frozen in the center of the room, afraid to touch anything. The windows reached nearly from floor to ceiling, offering a view of the gardens and the fields beyond. For one wild moment, I considered opening one, climbing out, running, until my legs gave out. But where would I go? Who would take in a runaway girl with no money, no education, and a powerful man hunting her down? I was as trapped as surely as if the room had been a cell. The ceremony took place at sunset in the Beaumont family chapel, a small stone building at the edge of the property. There were no friends, no family except for Daddy, just a handful of local dignitaries and business associates arranged in neat rows of pews. The preacher, a thin man with watery eyes, spoke of duty and obedience, of a woman's sacred role as helpmate and mother. Not once did he mention love. Not once did he mention choice. "Do you, Mabel Ruth Calloway, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" A question that wasn't really a question. A choice that wasn't really a choice. My voice was so small I barely heard it myself. "I do." And just like that, at 14 years old, I became Mrs. Everett Beaumont. The reception was held in the main house, a gathering of people who knew exactly what they were witnessing, but chose to pretend otherwise. They ate tiny sandwiches and drank champagne, conversing in low voices that hushed whenever I approached. I couldn't eat. My stomach was a knot of dread, counting down the minutes until everyone would leave and I would be alone with him. Daddy left without saying goodbye. He simply shook Mr. Beaumont's hand, nodded once in my direction, and climbed into a neighbor's truck. $20 richer than he'd been that morning. As darkness fell and the last guests departed, Mrs. Hendricks approached me with an expression that might have been sympathy if you looked at it sideways. "Mr. Beaumont is waiting for you in the master bedroom," she said quietly. "Top of the stairs, end of the hall." I stood at the base of that grand staircase, for what felt like hours, my legs refusing to carry me up. The house was silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer, counting down the seconds of freedom I'd never get back. Finally, I forced myself to climb. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, my body growing heavier with each passing moment. What happened in that bedroom that night lives in the darkest corners of my memory, locked away in a place I've tried for decades to forget. Some wounds never heal, they just teach you to carry the pain differently. Life in the Beaumont house fell into a pattern as rigid as the formal gardens that surrounded it. I was to be seen and not heard, to look pretty and remain silent, to fulfill my husband's needs and expectations without question or complaint. My days began before dawn when I would dress in one of the many outfits Mrs. Hendricks had ordered for me. Silk dresses in muted colors, pearl jewelry that felt like shackles around my neck, shoes that pinched my feet, and made walking a careful, measured thing. I was a doll being dressed up for display. Breakfast was served in the sunroom, a bright space overlooking gardens I wasn't allowed to tend. The French chef, Everett, employed prepared meals I couldn't pronounce, arranging them like artwork on china plates worth more than my family's monthly income. I missed cornbread and beans, fried chicken, and sweet potato pie. I missed food that filled your belly and warmed your heart. I wasn't allowed to leave the house unaccompanied. If I needed something from town, Mrs. Hendricks would escort me, watching my every interaction with the sharp eyes of a prison guard. I couldn't write letters without Everett reading them. First, couldn't make phone calls without him listening in on the extension. The other servants treated me with distant politeness, never forgetting that I was their employer's wife, but never quite accepting that I was truly the mistress of the house. I was too young, too clearly out of place, too obviously a victim rather than a partner. Mrs. Hendricks ran the household with military precision, her gray dress and stern expression a constant reminder of my place in the hierarchy. She was in her 50s, never married, devoted entirely to the Beaumont family and their reputation. "Mrs. Beaumont," she would say, her voice carrying a subtle emphasis that made my married name sound like an accusation. "Mr. Beaumont prefers his evening paper folded precisely in thirds. Perhaps you could see to it." I became skilled at reading the subtle signs of Everett's moods. When he came home from his business dealings in Birmingham or Montgomery, I could tell by the set of his shoulders whether the evening would be merely unpleasant or something worse. When he'd been drinking, which was most nights, his pale blue eyes would take on a glassy quality that made my stomach clench with fear. He would talk to me sometimes, usually when the whiskey had loosened his tongue, but he rarely talked to me. Instead, he spoke to Catherine, his first wife, calling me by her name and speaking of things that had happened before I was born. "You are always stubborn, Catherine," he would slur into my hair. "Always thought you were too good for this place, too good for me. Is that why you killed my son, to spite me?" In these moments, I learned fragments of Catherine's story. She had been beautiful from an old Charleston family, educated at a ladies' seminary. Their marriage had been arranged to unite two powerful families, but Catherine had never wanted children. She had lost 2 babies before the final pregnancy that took her life. Or so the official story went. In his drunken ramblings, Everett painted a different picture. Catherine had been distant, cold, refusing her wifely duties. She had deliberately brought about her own miscarriages, he claimed, preferring death to bearing his children. I began to understand that I was not just Catherine's replacement, but her punishment. Where she had been cold, I was expected to be warm. Where she had been defiant, I was expected to be obedient. Where she had chosen death, I was expected to choose submission. The worst part was the isolation. I missed my siblings' laughter, my mother's stern guidance, even my father's gruff commands. I missed belonging somewhere, even if that somewhere had been poor and difficult. At least there, I had been Mabel Ruth. Here I was, simply the wife, spoken in tones that suggested it was a euphemism for something shameful. It was during my 2nd year of marriage that I began to plan my escape. The idea started as a whisper in the back of my mind, a desperate fantasy that I would never have the courage to act upon. But desperation has a way of breeding bravery, and I was more desperate than I'd ever been in my life. The catalyst came on a cold February morning when Mrs. Jenkins, one of the younger maids, slipped me a note while bringing my breakfast tray. "Mrs. Beaumont," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "There's someone asking for you at the kitchen door. Says his name is Tommy. Says he's your brother." Tommy. My heart leaped into my throat. Tommy was my older brother, 16 now, and grown tall, the one who had taught me to climb trees and catch fireflies in mason jars. The one who had promised to look after me when I was scared. Where is he?" I was already on my feet, moving toward the kitchen with more energy than I'd shown in months. "Mrs. Hendricks sent him away." Mrs. Jenkins said, her eyes darting nervously. But he said he'd wait by the old oak at the property line. Said to tell you he needs to talk to you important-like. I hesitated. Everett was in Montgomery on business, but Mrs. Hendricks was a different kind of jailer, one who took her duties seriously. "Cover for me," I whispered. "Please. I'll be back before anyone notices." Mrs. Jenkins looked terrified, but she nodded. "Be quick, Mrs. Beaumont, and be careful." I slipped out the back door and across the south lawn, keeping close to the hedge line, where I wouldn't be visible from the house. My heart hammered against my ribs as I ran partly from exertion and partly from fear. If Everett found out I'd defied him, there would be consequences. But Tommy was waiting. The ancient oak stood at the far corner of the property, its massive branches reaching over the stone wall that marked the boundary between the Beaumont estate and the rest of the world. And there, leaning against its trunk, was a lanky boy in overalls too short for his growing frame. "Tommy," I called, forgetting caution in my joy. He turned his face, splitting into a grin that revealed the chipped front tooth from a childhood mishap. "Mabel Ruth?" We collided in a fierce hug, his arms wrapping around me with the unrestrained affection I'd been starved for since leaving home. When I pulled back to look at him, I saw that he'd grown taller, his face thinning from boy to young man. "What are you doing here?" I asked, wiping away tears I hadn't realized were falling. "How did you find me?" Tommy's expression sobered. "I've been working odd jobs, saving up money. Finally got enough for a bus ticket and asked around until someone pointed me to this place." He reached out to touch a bruise on my wrist that I'd tried to hide with powder. "Mabel Ruth, what has he done to you?" I pulled my sleeve down quickly. "I'm fine. He takes good care of me." "Don't lie to me." Tommy's voice was sharp, older than his 16 years. "People in town talk. They say things about Beaumont, about what happened to his first wife." A chill ran through me. "What things?" "Bad things. That she didn't die in childbirth like everyone says. That she was covered in bruises when they found her. That he—" Tommy trailed off, unable to speak the words aloud. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between us. "I'm getting you out of here," Tommy said finally. "I've got a plan." Hope flared in my chest, bright and dangerous. "How?" "I know a fellow with a car. He can pick you up, take you to the bus station in Birmingham. I've got money for a ticket to Nashville." Tommy's eyes were bright with determination. "We've got a cousin there who says you can stay till you find work. You're smart, Mabel Ruth. You could be a secretary or work in a store." For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine it. Freedom, a life of my own choosing, the chance to become someone other than Everett Beaumont's child bride. Then reality crashed back in. "Tommy, I can't. I'm married. It's against the law to leave your husband. It's against the law to beat your wife too, but that doesn't stop him, does it?" Before I could answer, Mrs. Hendricks's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Mrs. Beaumont." I turned to see her striding across the lawn, her face thunderous, two of the groundskeepers flanking her. "Go!" I whispered urgently, pushing Tommy toward the wall. "Go now!" "I'll come back," he promised, gripping my hands tightly. "I'll find a way to help you, Mabel Ruth. I swear it." Then he was gone, scrambling over the wall and disappearing into the woods beyond, leaving me to face Mrs. Hendricks's wrath. "Come with me, Mrs. Beaumont," she said, her voice cold as winter rain. "Mr. Beaumont will want to hear about this when he returns." But something had changed inside me. A seed had been planted, taking root in the fertile soil of my desperation. Tommy had shown me something I'd forgotten existed possibility. For the first time since that car had driven me away from everything I knew, I allowed myself to think the most dangerous thought of all escape. Everett returned from Montgomery that evening in a foul mood, his business dealings having gone poorly. Mrs. Hendricks wasted no time informing him of my transgression, and I was summoned to his study like a child called to account for breaking a vase. The study was Everett's domain, a dark-paneled room that smelled of cigar smoke and leather. The walls were lined with books I wasn't allowed to read their gilt spines, catching the light from the green banker's lamp on his desk. He sat behind that desk like a judge preparing to pass sentence. "You've disappointed me, Mabel Ruth," he said, without looking up from the ledger spread before him. "Mrs. Hendricks tells me you had an unauthorized visitor today." I clasped my hands tightly to keep them from shaking. "It was my brother, sir. I hadn't seen my family in 2 years." "Your family." He finally raised his eyes to mine, and I saw something cold and calculating in their pale depths. "You seem to have forgotten something important. I am your family now. That child you'll carry someday is your family. Those people you came from?" He paused, taking a sip from the crystal tumbler at his elbow. "They sold you to me for $20 and a promise to forget their debts. They've already forgotten you exist." The words hit me like physical blows. I knew they contained truth, but hearing it stated so baldly made my throat close up with shame and anger. "You are forbidden from leaving the house without my express permission," Everett continued. "No more walks in the garden, no more sitting on the porch. You'll remain inside where I can be certain you're safe." Safe, as if his concern were for my well-being rather than his ownership. "And if that boy or any of your people come around again, I'll have them arrested for trespassing. Then I'll have a conversation with your father about the consequences of not honoring our agreement." His smile was cold and sharp. "Do I make myself clear?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Good. Now come here." What followed was a demonstration of ownership, a reminder that my body belonged to him by law and by deed. When it was over, he dismissed me as casually as he might a servant who'd brought him coffee. I retreated to my room, to the 4-poster bed, with its silk hangings and down pillows that felt like luxury wrapped around a tomb. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the grandfather clock in the foyer chime the hours, and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to run. The plan formed slowly over the following weeks. I began to pay attention to the household routines, to the comings and goings of the staff, to Everett's business schedule. I learned that he traveled to Birmingham twice a month, staying overnight at his club. I discovered that Mrs. Hendricks visited her sister in town every Wednesday afternoon. I found out that Mrs. Jenkins had a brother who delivered produce to the kitchen. Most importantly, I learned where Everett kept his money. He had a safe in his study, but he also kept what he called mad money in the top drawer of his desk. Cash for impulse purchases, for bribes, for the kind of transactions that required immediate payment. I'd seen him take bills from that drawer, watched him count out 20s and 50s with the casual indifference of someone who had never known want. The opportunity came in late November, when Everett announced he would be traveling to Atlanta for a business conference. He would be gone for 3 days, leaving me alone with Mrs. Hendricks and the staff. "I expect everything to be in perfect order when I return," he said, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. "You've been looking peaked lately, Mabel Ruth. Perhaps you should rest more." I had been looking peaked because I'd been planning my escape, lying awake at night, going over every detail, every possible complication. But I simply nodded and wished him safe travels. The first day of his absence, I did nothing but wait and watch. The second day, I began to prepare. I packed a small valise with essentials, 2 dresses, undergarments, a sweater, the pearl necklace he'd given me that I could sell if necessary. I hid the valise in the back of my closet behind evening gowns I'd never chosen to wear. That night, while Mrs. Hendricks was making her final rounds, I crept down to the study. My heart hammered so loud, I was certain someone would hear it, but the house was quiet except for the ticking of that damned clock. The desk drawer wasn't locked. Why would it be when his wife was kept under such tight control? I opened it with trembling fingers and found exactly what I'd hoped for, a thick stack of bills held together with a rubber band. I took $60, enough for a bus ticket to Nashville and a few days' survival. My hands shook so badly I dropped some coins, the sound of metal on hardwood seeming to echo through the house like gunshots. But no one came. No one heard. I crept back to my room, the stolen money burning like coal in my pocket. The third day was the longest of my life. I sat by the window, watching the driveway for any sign of Everett's early return, starting at every sound, every creak of the old house settling. Mrs. Jenkins had agreed to help me, risking her job and possibly her safety to aid my escape. "My brother Ray will be here at midnight," she whispered as she brought my dinner tray. "He'll be making a delivery to the kitchen. You'll have to be ready." I was ready. I had been ready for months, for years, for my entire life. At 11:30, I heard Mrs. Hendricks making her nightly rounds, checking doors and windows with the thoroughness of a prison guard. At 11:45, the house fell silent except for the grandfather clock and the sound of rain beginning to fall against the windows. I waited until midnight, then picked up my valise and crept downstairs, avoiding the third step that always creaked. The house was dark shadows stretching like grasping hands across the polished floors. Mrs. Jenkins waited in the kitchen, her face tight with anxiety. "He's here," she whispered. Around back by the gardener's shed, I started to thank her, but she pressed a small package into my hands. "Sandwiches for the trip," she said. Then she pressed something else into my palm, a tiny silver cross on a chain. For protection, I hugged her fiercely, this woman who had risked everything to help a girl she barely knew. Then I slipped out the back door into the rain-soaked night. The November rain fell in sheets, turning the perfectly manicured grounds of the Beaumont estate into a muddy obstacle course. I ran toward the gardener's shed, my shoes squelching in the wet earth, my coat already soaked through. The darkness seemed alive, full of shapes that might have been bushes or men sent to drag me back. A figure stood beside an old pickup truck, barely visible through the curtain of rain. "Mrs. Beaumont?" he called softly. "Yes," I gasped, reaching him. "You're Ray." He was a thin man in his 30s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. He took my valise and tossed it into the truck bed, then helped me into the passenger seat. "Keep your head down till we're off the property," he advised, starting the engine. "Just in case." I slid down in the seat, my heart hammering, as we bumped along the service road toward the rear gate. Every second stretched into eternity, every splash through a puddle sounding like thunder in my ears. But we made it. The gate stood open and we turned onto the county road, picking up speed as Ray pointed us toward Birmingham and the bus station. "You sure about this?" he asked, glancing at me as we drove through the storm. "Once you get on that bus, there's no turning back." I looked back through the rain-streaked window at the Beaumont mansion, its white columns barely visible in the darkness. For 3 years, that house had been my prison, its luxury a trap that had nearly broken me. "I'm sure," I said and meant it. The Greyhound station in Birmingham was a harsh fluorescent island in the storm, nearly empty, except for a few drowsy travelers and a bored ticket agent. Ray waited until I'd purchased my ticket one way to Nashville, departing at 3:15 a.m. before reluctantly leaving me. "You sure you'll be all right?" he asked, eyeing the mostly empty station. "I'll be fine," I assured him, summoning a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Thank you for everything." For the next hour, I sat stiffly on a plastic bench valise, clutched to my chest, jumping at every sound. Each time the station door opened, my heart seized with terror that it would be Everett or one of his men come to drag me back. But no one came. At 3:15 sharp, the bus pulled in, a silver giant with Nashville emblazoned on its destination board. I boarded with shaking legs, found a seat near the middle, and pressed my face to the window as the driver fired up the engine. As the bus pulled away from the station, leaving Birmingham and Alabama behind, I allowed myself to exhale fully for the first time in 3 years. I was 17 years old, alone with $60 and a stolen pearl necklace to my name. But I was free. The bus rumbled through the night, its headlights cutting through the darkness as we traveled north toward Tennessee. Around me, other passengers dozed or stared out rain-streaked windows, each lost in their own thoughts. No one paid attention to a young woman traveling alone, and for once being invisible felt like a blessing. Somewhere around the Tennessee border, exhaustion finally claimed me. I dreamed of oak trees and creek beds, of my little sister's laugh, of a future that might somehow be mine to shape. When I woke, the landscape outside had changed. Rolling hills instead of Alabama flatlands, different trees, different possibilities. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, washed world that seemed to sparkle in the early morning light. "Next stop, Nashville," the driver announced over the crackling intercom. I sat up straighter, smoothing my wrinkled dress, trying to tidy my hair. In a few minutes, I would step off this bus into a city I'd never seen, without connections, without a plan beyond finding work and hoping for the best. But whatever happened next, it would be on my own terms. Nashville, in November 1965, was a city caught between its past and its future, where the Old South met the new music industry in a collision of tradition and innovation. The terminal bustled with early morning commuters, traveling salesmen, and hopeful musicians carrying battered guitar cases and impossible dreams. I stepped off the bus into this swirling chaos, overwhelmed by the noise and movement after 3 years of enforced quietude. The air smelled of diesel fumes and coffee bacon and cigarettes, the scent of a city waking up to face another day. At the information desk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and iron-gray hair looked up from her paperwork. "Can I help you, honey? I'm looking for work," I said, my Alabama accent suddenly seeming very pronounced. "I heard there might be jobs at the telephone company." She studied me for a moment, taking in my wrinkled dress, my too thin frame, the shadows under my eyes. Something in her expression softened. "Southern Bell's hiring," she said, pulling out a city map and circling a location with her pencil. 3 blocks that way, big building with blue doors, can't miss it." She hesitated, then added gently, "They don't usually start interviews till 9, though. You look like you could use some breakfast first." My stomach growled at the mention of food. I hadn't eaten since the sandwiches Mrs. Jenkins had packed consumed nervously somewhere in northern Alabama. "There's a decent diner around the corner," the woman continued. "Tell Marlene at the counter that Betty sent you. She might have some information about rooms to let too if you're needing a place." "Thank you," I said, clutching the map like a lifeline. "I appreciate your kindness." She smiled, and I saw a hint of sadness in her eyes. Us women got to look out for each other in this world, don't we? The diner was warm and fragrant, with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. I found a seat at the counter and ordered eggs and toast, real food that tasted like hope after years of fancy meals that had no soul. Marlene was a bottle blonde with bright red lipstick and eyes that had seen more of life than they cared to remember. When I mentioned Betty's name, she nodded knowingly. "Betty's got a good eye for folks who need a helping hand," she said, refilling my coffee cup. "You looking for work or a room or both?" "Both," I admitted. "I'm hoping to get hired at the telephone company." Marlene studied me with sharp eyes. "You running from something, honey?" The question caught me off guard. I started to deny it, then realized there was no point. "Someone," I said quietly. "My husband." She nodded, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "I got a cousin runs a boarding house for young ladies. Clean place, decent neighborhood, not too expensive. No men allowed past the front parlor, strict curfew." "That sound like what you need?" It sounded like salvation. "Yes, ma'am, that would be perfect." By 8:30, I had eaten my first real meal in days, gotten directions to both the telephone company and the boarding house, and begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could make this work. The Southern Bell building loomed ahead, taller than anything in my hometown, its blue doors gleaming in the morning sun. I paused on the sidewalk, staring up at its many windows, fear momentarily overtaking determination. What was I doing here? I was 17 years old, with an 8th grade education and no work experience beyond household chores. Who did I think I was imagining I could start over like this? Then I remembered Tommy's words from that day by the oak tree. "You're smart, Mabel Ruth. You could be a secretary or work in a store." Drawing a deep breath, I squared my shoulders and climbed the steps to those blue doors. The reception area bustled with activity. Young women in identical uniforms hurried past phones, rang constantly, and the clicking of typewriter keys provided a steady background rhythm. I approached the front desk, where a stern-faced woman sat behind a nameplate identifying her as Mrs. Eleanor Watson, Personnel Director. "May I help you?" she asked without looking up from her paperwork. "Yes, ma'am. I've come about the telephone operator position." Now she looked up, assessing me with sharp brown eyes. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, ma'am. I just arrived in Nashville, but I'm a quick learner and I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired." A faint smile crossed her lips. "Confident, aren't you?" She handed me a form. "Fill this out. We'll need references, previous employment history, education, background." My heart sank. References, previous employment. All I had was 3 years as a child bride, and before that farm work that had never been official. "I don't have references," I admitted. "I'm 17. I've never had a proper job." Mrs. Watson's eyebrows rose. 17. The advertisement specified 18 and older. "Please," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "I need this job. I'll do anything. I'll work nights, weekends, holidays. I'll prove myself." She studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. "What's your story, child? And don't tell me it's nothing. I've been hiring girls for 15 years, and I know desperation when I see it." So I told her, not everything but enough. A young marriage that had gone wrong, a need to start over, a determination to make something of myself. Mrs. Watson listened without interruption, her face growing more serious with each word. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "We have a training program," she said finally. 6 weeks to learn the job. You'll start at the bottom, but if you're as hardworking as you claim, there's room for advancement." She paused. "Can you start Monday?" I nearly cried with relief. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," she said with a small smile. "Wait until you've survived your first week." The boarding house was a 3-story Victorian on a tree-lined street, its wraparound porch dotted with rocking chairs and hanging baskets of ferns. Helen Morrison, the proprietor, was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived. "Marlene called ahead," she said, leading me up the front steps. "Said you might need a place to stay. You look like you could use a good meal and a safe bed." The room she showed me was small but clean, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the street. It was more space than I'd had to call my own since childhood. $25 a week, Helen said. That includes breakfast and dinner, laundry privileges, and use of the common areas. No men above the first floor, lights out by 11, and no drinking or carrying on. She paused. "Think you can live with those rules?" "Yes, ma'am. More than live with them, I'm grateful for them." That first week at Southern Belle was a baptism by fire. The training was intensive learning to connect calls on the massive switchboard, memorizing procedures, practicing the precise diction required for professional phone service. My supervisor, Miss Carter, was a no-nonsense woman who demanded perfection. "Good morning, Southern Belle operator speaking. How may I help you?" The phrase became as natural as breathing, repeated hundreds of times a day as I learned to route calls across the city and beyond. The other girls were friendly enough, though they kept their distance at first. Most were from Nashville or nearby towns with families and boyfriends and normal lives. I was the mystery girl, the one who kept to herself and never talked about her past. Where you from, Mabel?" asked Sarah Jenkins, a girl about my age with red hair and a ready smile. "Alabama," I said, which was true enough. "What brought you to Nashville?" "Looking for opportunities," I replied, which was also true, just not the whole truth. The work was hard, but satisfying. For the first time in my life, I was earning my own money, making my own decisions, building something that belonged to me alone. My first paycheck was only $18, but I held it in my hands like it was made of gold. Evenings at the boarding house were pleasant in a way I'd never experienced. Dinner was served family style in the dining room, 8 young women gathering around a table to share food and conversation. We talked about work, about the news, about dreams and plans for the future. "I'm going to save up for secretarial school," said Martha, who worked at an insurance company. "Learn shorthand and typing, make real money. I want to get married and have babies." said Louise, who was engaged to a boy from her hometown. "But not until I've seen something of the world first." When they asked about my plans, I found myself saying, "I want to get my high school diploma, maybe go to college someday." It was the first time I'd spoken the dream aloud, and saying it made it feel real. As winter turned to spring, I began to feel like myself again. The constant fear that had been my companion for 3 years slowly faded, replaced by a cautious optimism. I was still jumpy, around men still had nightmares sometimes, but I was healing. Mrs. Watson had been right about opportunities for advancement. After 6 months, I was promoted to senior operator with a raise to $22 a week. It was enough to start saving money to begin planning for the future. I enrolled in evening classes at the YMCA, working toward my high school equivalency diploma. 3 nights a week after a full day at the telephone company, I sat in a classroom learning algebra and literature, history, and science. The other students were mostly adults who'd left school early for work or family obligations, and I felt at home among them. My teacher, Mr. Peterson, was a retired professor who believed in second chances. "Education is the great equalizer," he told us. "It doesn't matter where you come from or what you've been through. What matters is where you're going." I carried those words with me like a talisman. I had been in Nashville for nearly 2 years when my carefully constructed new life came crashing down around me. It was a Tuesday morning in September 1967, and I was at my position on the switchboard routing calls with the efficiency that had made me one of the company's most reliable operators. "Southern Bell operator speaking. How may I help you?" "I'd like to place a long-distance call to Nashville, Tennessee," came the response. The voice was familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. "What number would you like to call, sir?" "I'm not sure of the number. I'm looking for someone who works there." A young woman named Mabel Ruth. My blood turned to ice. The voice, I realized, belonged to Everett Beaumont. "I'm sorry, sir." I managed my voice, somehow remaining steady. "I can't provide information about our employees. Perhaps you could give her a message? Tell her that her husband is looking for her. Tell her it's time to come home." The line went dead. I sat frozen at my station, the magnitude of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Everett had found me. After 2 years of freedom, 2 years of building a life, he had tracked me down. How had someone seen me in Birmingham? Had he hired a private detective? Did he know where I lived, where I worked, who I'd become? I made it through the rest of my shift on autopilot, my hands connecting calls, while my mind raced through possibilities. I could run again, disappear into another city, start over somewhere else. But the thought of abandoning everything I'd built here, the job I loved, the friends I'd made, the education I was pursuing, made me feel sick. That evening, I sat in my room at the boarding house, staring out the window at the street below. Every passing car made me nervous. Every footstep on the sidewalk might be him coming to drag me back to Alabama. A knock at my door made me jump. "Mabel!" It was Helen's voice. "You have a visitor downstairs." My heart nearly stopped. This was it. He'd found me. But when I crept down the stairs, I found not Everett Beaumont, but a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit holding a briefcase and wearing a tired expression. "Miss Calloway," he said, standing as I entered the front parlor. "My name is James Mitchell. I'm an attorney from Birmingham." I remained standing, ready to run. "What do you want?" "I represent the estate of Everett Beaumont," he said, and my world tilted on its axis. "Estate," I whispered. "Mr. Beaumont died 3 months ago. Heart attack. I've been trying to locate you regarding his will." Everett was dead. The man who had owned me, controlled me, terrorized me for 3 years, was dead. I should have felt relief, joy, something other than the strange numbness that settled over me like a blanket. "I don't understand," I said, sinking into a chair. "His will, he left you something. A letter and a small bequest. But first, I need to inform you that your marriage has been legally dissolved. Mr. Beaumont had it annulled shortly after you left on grounds of abandonment." The lawyer's voice was gentle. "You're not his wife anymore, Miss Calloway. You're free." Free! The word echoed in my mind like a bell tolling. Not just practically free as I'd been for 2 years, but legally free. The chains that had bound me to that life were finally officially broken. "The letter?" I asked. He handed me an envelope yellowed with age. My name was written on it in Everett's familiar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Mabel Ruth, if you're reading this, then I am dead, and you are free. I know you will not mourn me, nor should you. I was not a good husband to you, just as I was not a good husband to Catherine before you. I married you for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with my own broken need to control someone. In doing so, I stole your childhood and nearly destroyed your spirit. I am sorry for that. The enclosed check is not payment for your suffering. No amount of money could compensate for that. It is simply a hope that you will use it to build the life you deserve, the life I prevented you from living. Be well, Mabel Ruth. Be happy. E. Beaumont." The check was for $5,000 more money than I'd ever seen in my life. I looked up at the lawyer, tears streaming down my face. "I don't understand. Why would he do this?" "Guilt, perhaps. Or maybe he found some measure of conscience in his final years." Mr. Mitchell closed his briefcase. "Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, said to tell you that she helped him write it. She said you'd understand what that meant." Mrs. Hendricks, the stern woman who had watched over me, who had seemed so cold and disapproving. She had helped Everett write his apology, had tracked me down to make sure I received it. After the lawyer left, I sat in the front parlor for a long time, holding the letter and the check. Helen found me there, an hour later, brought me a cup of tea, and sat beside me without asking questions. "Good news or bad news?" she asked finally. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "I think it might be both." The letter from Everett's lawyer was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. 2 weeks later, I received another visitor at the boarding house, one who would change everything I thought I knew about my time in the Beaumont mansion. Mrs. Hendricks stood on the front porch looking older and more fragile than I remembered. She wore a simple black dress and carried a small carpet bag, her steel gray hair pinned in its familiar severe bun. "Hello, Mabel Ruth," she said quietly. "May I come in?" I led her to the front parlor, my mind reeling. Why was she here? What did she want? "I know you must be surprised to see me." She began settling into the chair across from me. "I came because there are things you need to know. Things I should have told you years ago." I waited, my hands clenched in my lap. "I helped you escape," she said simply. "Not directly, but I made it possible. I made sure I would be away from the house that night. I told Mrs. Jenkins about Mr. Beaumont's travel schedule. I even left the back door unlocked." I stared at her, speechless. Mrs. Hendricks, the stern housekeeper who had seemed to disapprove of everything I did, had helped orchestrate my escape. "Why?" I whispered. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "Because I was you once. 40 years ago, I was a 16-year-old girl who married a man 3 times her age. My husband was Everett's father, the first Mr. Beaumont." The room seemed to spin around me. "You were his stepmother." "I was his father's child bride, just as you were his. I lived in that house for 25 years, bearing children I couldn't protect, enduring things I won't speak of, even now." Her voice was steady, but I could see the pain in her eyes. "When my husband died, Everett let me stay on as housekeeper. I had nowhere else to go. The pieces began to fall into place. Mrs. Hendricks's stern disapproval hadn't been directed at me, but at the situation. Her rigid enforcement of rules hadn't been cruelty, but protection. "Catherine," I said suddenly. "His first wife, what really happened to her?" Mrs. Hendricks's face went pale. "She died in childbirth, just as the doctor said. But—" She paused, struggling with the words. "She was terrified of having children. Everett was not gentle with her, and she was small, delicate. When she became pregnant for the 3rd time, she was convinced she would die." And did she die in childbirth? She died giving birth to a stillborn son. But before that, she made me promise something. Mrs. Hendricks leaned forward, her eyes intense. She made me promise that if Everett ever brought another young girl into that house, I would do everything in my power to help her escape. The weight of this revelation settled over me like a heavy blanket. Catherine, the woman whose name Everett had whispered in the dark, had known what would happen to me. She had tried to protect me from beyond the grave. The money you took from his desk? Mrs. Hendricks continued. I replaced it the next morning. I knew he would blame you if he discovered it missing. You covered for me. I covered for all of us. For you, for Mrs. Jenkins, for everyone who helped you get away. Because we all knew what would happen if you stayed. I sat in stunned silence, processing everything she had told me. Mrs. Hendricks, the woman I had feared almost as much as Everett himself, had been my guardian angel all along. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Why didn't you let me know you were trying to help? Because you needed to believe you were doing it yourself. You needed to find your own strength, your own courage. If you had known I was helping you, might have become dependent on me instead of learning to depend on yourself. There was wisdom in her words, even if I couldn't fully understand it then. What will you do now? I asked. I'm too old to start over, she said with a slight smile. But I have enough saved to rent a small apartment in Birmingham. I'll live quietly, tend a garden, maybe volunteer at the church. It will be enough. Before she left, she pressed something into my hand. It was a small wooden box intricately carved. This belonged to Catherine, she said. She asked me to give it to you someday if you ever came back or if I found you. She said you would understand its meaning. Inside the box was a single key, old and tarnished. What does it open? I asked. Nothing anymore. It was the key to her hope chest, the one she brought from Charleston when she married. She said to tell you that it represents the dreams she never got to fulfill, the choices she never got to make. She wanted you to have it as a reminder that you still have choices, that your dreams are still possible. After Mrs. Hendricks left, I sat in my room holding Catherine's key and thinking about the invisible threads that connect us all. A woman I had never met, who had died years before I was born, had reached across time to offer me protection and hope. It was then that I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I would use Everett's money not just to build my own future, but to help other women who found themselves trapped as I had been. I would make sure that Catherine's promise of protection lived on. The $5,000 from Everett's estate transformed my life in ways I could never have imagined. For the first time since leaving Alabama, I had real choices, real opportunities to shape my future instead of merely surviving each day. I used some of the money to move into a small apartment of my own, a sunny one-bedroom place just a few blocks from the boarding house. It was modest, but it was mine, every stick of furniture chosen by me, every picture on the wall placed there because I liked it. I also enrolled in business classes at the community college, studying accounting and office management. My supervisor at Southern Bell, Mrs. Watson, had been promoted to regional manager, and she encouraged my educational pursuits. You have a good head for numbers, Mabel, she said, reviewing my latest performance evaluation. Have you considered moving into management yourself? The idea had occurred to me, though I'd been afraid to voice it. Management positions were almost exclusively held by men, and I was still just 19 years old. I'd like that, I said, but I'm not sure I'm qualified. Qualification is about more than just age or experience, Mrs. Watson replied. It's about intelligence, dedication, and the ability to lead others. You have all of those qualities. She was right. By 1968, I had been promoted to shift supervisor, overseeing a team of 12 operators. It was challenging work, but I loved the responsibility, the problem-solving, the satisfaction of helping my team succeed. My personal life was also beginning to bloom. I had maintained my friendship with the girls from the boarding house, and through them I met other young people who were building their lives in Nashville. We went to movies, to concerts, to the coffee house near the university, where folk singers performed and students debated the issues of the day. It was at one of these gatherings that I met David Chen, a medical student whose family had immigrated from Taiwan. He was quiet and thoughtful, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded me of my brother Tommy. "What brings you to Nashville?" he asked over coffee one evening. "I'm building a life," I said, and realized it was the truest thing I'd ever said. David and I became friends first, then something more. He was patient with my hesitations, understanding about the walls I'd built around my heart. When I finally told him about my past, about the marriage that had stolen my childhood, he listened without judgment. "You're the strongest person I know," he said simply. "What you've overcome, what you've built, it's remarkable." We were married in the spring of 1970 in a small ceremony at the church I'd been attending. Mrs. Watson was my matron of honor, and Tommy, who had managed to save enough money for a bus ticket, walked me down the aisle. "I'm proud of you, Mabel Ruth," he whispered as we stood at the altar. "You made it. You really made it." David and I honeymooned in the Smoky Mountains, staying in a cabin beside a creek that reminded me of the one where I'd played as a child. But these were different memories, chosen memories made with love instead of endured in fear. Our daughter Sarah was born in 1972, a perfect baby, with David's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. Holding her for the first time, I was overwhelmed by the fierce protectiveness that rose in my chest. This child would never know the fear that had defined my early years. She would grow up knowing she was loved, knowing she had choices, knowing she could be anything she dreamed of becoming. I took a leave of absence from Southern Belle to care for Sarah, but I didn't stop working entirely. I had been volunteering at a women's shelter downtown, helping to counsel women who were fleeing abusive relationships. The work was difficult but meaningful, and it connected me to the promise I'd made to Catherine's memory. In 1974, I helped establish the Davidson County Women's Crisis Center using a portion of Everett's money to fund the initial operations. We provided shelter counseling and legal assistance to women who were trapped in dangerous situations. Every woman deserves to be safe, I told the reporter who interviewed me for the newspaper story about the center's opening. Every woman deserves to choose her own path. The center grew rapidly as word spread about the services we provided. We helped hundreds of women escape abusive relationships, find jobs, secure housing, rebuild their lives. Each success story felt like a small victory against the darkness that had once threatened to swallow me whole. I returned to Southern Belle in 1975, this time as a district manager. It was a position that had never been held by a woman, and I was determined to prove that I deserved it. Under my leadership, our district became one of the most efficient and productive in the region. But it was my work with the Crisis Center that truly defined my later years. I served on the board of directors, helped write grant proposals, and continued to counsel women who were struggling to break free from abusive relationships. One evening in 1978, a young woman came to the center who reminded me so much of my younger self that it took my breath away. She was 17, pregnant, and terrified of the husband who had been beating her since their wedding night 6 months earlier. "I don't know how to leave," she whispered, clutching my hand. "I don't know where to go." "You've already taken the hardest step," I told her. "You've decided that you deserve better. Everything else is just logistics." We helped her find a safe place to stay, connected her with job training programs, and supported her through the legal process of obtaining a restraining order. 2 years later, she sent me a photo of her son's second birthday party, a picture of a woman who had reclaimed her life and her joy. Stories like hers were the reason I did the work, the reason I got up every morning and fought for women who were still trapped in the darkness I had escaped. In 1985, I received a phone call that brought my past full circle. It was from a lawyer in Alabama informing me that my father had died and left me a small inheritance. It wasn't much, the old family farm and a few $100s, but it represented something important, a connection to my roots, to the people who had shaped me, even in their imperfect way. David and I drove to Alabama with Sarah, who was now 13, and curious about her mother's mysterious past. The farm looked smaller than I remembered, the fields overgrown with weeds, the house weathered and empty. Tommy was there along with my sister Jessie and two of my younger brothers. We had maintained contact over the years, but seeing them all together again brought tears to my eyes. "Look at you," Jessie said, hugging me tightly. "All grown up and successful. Mama would be so proud." We spent the afternoon walking through the house, sharing memories and stories. I showed Sarah the room where I'd slept as a child, the kitchen where I'd learned to cook, the oak tree where I'd dreamed of escape. "It's hard to imagine you living here," Sarah said, looking around with the eyes of a child who had grown up in comfort and security. "It's so different from our house." "Different isn't always bad," I told her. This place taught me important lessons about strength and resilience, about the value of family and the power of dreams. That evening, as we sat on the front porch watching the sunset, Tommy brought up the subject I'd been dreading. "I heard about Beaumont," he said quietly. "About what happened to him." I nodded. "He's been dead for almost 20 years now." "Good riddance," Tommy said fiercely. "I always regretted not being able to get you out of there sooner." You did get me out," I said, taking his hand. "You planted the seed of hope that made everything else possible. If you hadn't come to see me that day, I might never have found the courage to run." We decided to sell the farm to a neighboring family who would continue farming the land. With the proceeds, I established a scholarship fund for young women from rural Alabama who wanted to pursue higher education. It seemed like the right way to honor my parents' memory and give something back to the community that had shaped me. As we drove back to Nashville, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. From a terrified 14-year-old girl forced into marriage to a successful businesswoman and advocate for women's rights, I had traveled further than I'd ever imagined possible. The road had been difficult, marked by trauma and loss, but it had also been filled with unexpected kindness, second chances, and the gradual discovery of my own strength. I had learned that resilience isn't about never falling down, but about getting back up every time you're knocked down. I had also learned that healing is possible, that the wounds of the past don't have to define your future. With the right support, the right opportunities, and the determination to never give up, anyone can rebuild their life. In 1992, I was honored by the Tennessee Commission on Women for my work with domestic violence survivors. Standing at the podium in the state capitol, looking out at an audience of women who had fought their own battles and won their own victories, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. "I am here today not because I'm extraordinary," I said, "but because I'm ordinary. I'm an ordinary woman who refused to accept that her circumstances were permanent. I'm an ordinary woman who believed that she deserved better even when the world told her otherwise." The applause was thunderous, but what meant more to me were the individual women who approached me afterward, sharing their own stories of survival and transformation. Each one reminded me of why this work mattered, why Catherine's promise of protection needed to live on. David and I retired in 1995, though I continued my volunteer work with the Crisis Center. We traveled, spending time with Sarah and her family, enjoying the luxury of time together after decades of building careers and raising a family. But even in retirement, I couldn't fully escape the past. In 2000, I was contacted by a journalist who was researching a book about child marriage in the American South. She had discovered records of my marriage to Everett Beaumont and wanted to interview me about my experience. At first, I was reluctant. The wounds had healed, but the scars remained, and I wasn't sure I wanted to make my story public. But then I thought about all the girls who were still trapped in similar situations, who might benefit from knowing that escape was possible. If my story can help even one young woman find the courage to seek help, I told the journalist, then it's worth telling. The book was published in 2001, and my story became part of a larger narrative about the persistence of child marriage in America. I received letters from readers around the world, many of them survivors of similar experiences, who thanked me for speaking out. One letter from a teenage girl in rural Georgia particularly moved me. She wrote, "Reading your story gave me hope that there's a way out. I'm only 16, but I'm not giving up. I'm going to be like you someday. That letter reminded me that stories have power, that sharing our experiences can light the way for others who are still walking in darkness. As I sit on my front porch, now watching the seasons change in the Tennessee hills, I marvel at the journey that brought me here. I am 76 years old, surrounded by the life I chose and the family I built secure in the knowledge that I am exactly where I'm meant to be. David passed away 3 years ago after a long battle with cancer. His death was peaceful, surrounded by love, and while I miss him terribly, I am grateful for the 45 years we had together. He taught me that not all men are predators, that love can be gentle and nurturing, that marriage can be a partnership of equals. Sarah is now a successful lawyer specializing in family law and domestic violence cases. She has 2 daughters of her own, bright and confident girls who know their worth and refuse to accept anything less than they deserve. Sometimes I see myself in them, the fierce determination that sustained me through the darkest times. The Crisis Center continues to thrive, now serving women across 3 counties. We have helped thousands of women escape abusive relationships, find jobs, secure housing, and rebuild their lives. The work is far from over, but every success story proves that change is possible. I keep Catherine's key on my nightstand, a reminder of the woman who reached across time to offer me protection and hope. Sometimes I wonder what she would think of the life I've built, the choices I've made, the women I've helped. I hope she would be proud. I also keep a photo of the oak tree from my childhood, the one where I used to sit and dream of escape. It was cut down years ago to make way for a new highway, but it lives on in my memory as a symbol of the power of dreams and the importance of never giving up hope. The nightmares have mostly stopped, though. I still sometimes wake in the middle of the night, momentarily confused about where I am. But then I remember I am safe. I am free. I am home. Recently, I've been working on a memoir expanding on the story I told to that journalist 20 years ago. I want to document not just the trauma, but the healing. Not just the escape, but the rebuilding. Not just the survival, but the triumph. Because that's what this story is, ultimately a triumph. Not just my triumph, but the triumph of every woman who refuses to accept abuse, who chooses hope over despair, who believes that she deserves better. I think about the 14-year-old girl who was forced to marry a man 3 times her age, who thought her life was over before it had really begun. I wish I could tell her that it gets better, that the darkness isn't permanent, that she has reserves of strength she doesn't even know exist. I wish I could tell her that she will not just survive, but thrive. That she will build a life filled with love and purpose. That she will use her pain to help others. That she will find peace in the end. Most of all, I wish I could tell her that she is not alone. That there are others who have walked this path before her, who have emerged from the darkness into the light. That there are people who will help her, who will believe in her, who will stand with her as she fights for her freedom. But I can't speak to that frightened girl across the years. I can only speak to the women who are walking that path now, who are trapped in marriages they never chose, who are living lives that feel like prisons. To them, I say this: you are not alone. You are not without options. You are not doomed to repeat the patterns that brought you to this place. You have choices even when it doesn't feel like it. You have strength even when you feel weak. You have worth even when others treat you as worthless. The path to freedom is not easy, but it is possible. It requires courage, determination, and the willingness to take enormous risks. But the alternative, remaining trapped in a life that is slowly killing your spirit, is far worse. Seek help. There are people who understand what you're going through, who can provide resources and support. There are shelters, counselors, legal advocates, and organizations dedicated to helping women escape abusive situations. Don't give up. The darkness is not permanent. The pain is not forever. There is light on the other side, and it's worth fighting for. Trust yourself. You know when something is wrong, when you're not being treated with the respect and dignity you deserve. Don't let anyone convince you that abuse is normal, that you're overreacting, that you somehow deserve what's happening to you. You don't deserve it. You never deserved it. You deserve love, respect, safety, and the freedom to choose your own path. The mockingbirds are singing their evening song now, and the air is sweet with the scent of honeysuckle. I am 76 years old, and I am free. I am surrounded by the life I chose and the people I love. I am exactly where I'm meant to be. It has been a long journey from that terrified 14-year-old girl to the woman I am today. But every step of that journey, every struggle and triumph, every moment of despair and hope has led me to this moment. I am Mabel Ruth Calloway, and this is my story. It is a story of survival, of resilience, of the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest circumstances. It is a story of hope, and it is far from over.